You used to want things, specific things, the promotion, the body, the relationship, the number in the account. You had a hunger that was reliable. It got you up. It organized your days. And then something happened. Not a failure, not a loss. Something quieter and more disorienting than either of those. You woke up one morning and the wanting was gone. Not suppressed, not deferred. Gone. You looked at the goals that used to pull you forward and felt nothing. Not peace, not contentment. A specific, bewildering flatness. Like the signal dropped and no one told you the tower was being dismantled. So you did what any reasonable person does. You tried to fix it, watched the motivation content, built the new routine, told yourself it was a phase, a dip, a temporary recalibration. But weeks became months, and the flatness didn't resolve. And now, underneath the flatness, there is something worse. Fear. Because the people around you are still wanting things, still grinding, still posting the results. And you are standing in the wreckage of your own ambition, trying to understand how something that felt like awakening has produced something that looks, from the outside and sometimes from the inside, like collapse. This is not a motivation problem. It is not depression, though it can look like depression. It is not laziness, though people who still have their old hunger will call it that. What you are experiencing is the specific, documented, psychologically precise consequence of having crossed a threshold that the self-help industry never tells you exists. Because on the other side of that threshold, the tools that worked before don't work anymore. And the person who needed those tools is in the process of dying. And nothing about that process is comfortable. Carl Jung called this the night sea journey. He borrowed the image from ancient mythology, the hero swallowed by the whale, descending into darkness, losing all orientation, all certainty, all the props of the previous identity. And he was precise about when it happens, not to people who are failing, to people who have succeeded at the first half of life, who have built the external architecture, who have achieved enough to discover that achievement, while real, does not answer the question that is now refusing to be quiet, the question that the noise of ambition was successfully drowning out until the awakening made the noise impossible to generate with the same conviction. You are in that descent, and there are 5 specific things about how you have been relating to motivation, to purpose, to the entire architecture of wanting and achieving that must be examined with the kind of honesty that the previous version of you was not equipped to sustain. The first is the story you have been telling about what motivation is. The mask looks like this. Motivation is the fuel, the thing you cultivate, protect, and leverage to produce results. You treat it like a resource to be managed, a fire to be fed, a psychological asset that separates the people who achieve from the people who don't. When you have it, you use it. When you lose it, you find strategies to get it back. The entire architecture of your productive life has been built on the premise that motivation is both available and necessary, and that its absence is a problem to be solved. The dark truth is that the motivation you are mourning was never yours. It was assembled from borrowed material, from social comparison, from the hunger to prove something to someone who once made you feel insufficient, from the fear of a specific kind of failure that was loaded with meaning before you had the capacity to examine the meaning critically, from the collective definition of a successful life that you absorbed before you had the philosophical equipment
to question whether it was a definition that fit the actual shape of your interior. That motivation was real. It produced real results, but it was running on a fuel source that the awakening has made it impossible to pretend is clean. And now that you can see what it was actually made of, you cannot generate it with the same unconscious ease, not because you've become weak, because you've become honest.
The strategic kill is the death of the goal of recovering the old motivation. You will not recover it, not because it's gone forever, but because the version of you that ran on it is in the process of being retired. What comes next runs on something different, slower to ignite, less dramatic in its presentation, but structurally impossible to exhaust in the way the old fuel was exhausted, because it is not organized around anyone else's definition of arrival. The second chapter is the relationship between awakening and identity dissolution. The mask looks like this. You know who you are. You have a sense of self that is stable and coherent, and that you have invested years in building. Your values, your aesthetics, your professional identity, your social role, the person you present to the world, and the person you experience yourself to be in private are reasonably continuous. When the awakening began, you may have even welcomed the early stages because they felt like expansion, like you were becoming more rather than less. The dark truth is that what you welcomed as expansion is a dissolution that you did not fully consent to and cannot stop midway. Jung was unambiguous about this. The individuation process, the movement toward genuine selfhood, as opposed to the socially constructed persona, requires the systematic deconstruction of every aspect of the identity that was assembled from external material. Every role that was performed for approval, every value that was adopted to belong, every ambition that was organized around the management of other people's perceptions, all of it is subject to review. All of it will feel unstable during that review, and the loss of motivation you are experiencing is, in significant part, the motivational system losing its organizing structure because the identity that the motivation was serving is no longer stable. The strategic kill is the death of the project of stabilizing your identity before the dissolution is complete. This is the move that most people in this stage make and that costs them the most time. They feel the dissolution happening and they work harder to hold the previous shape together. More discipline, more routine, more commitment to the external markers of the person they were before the threshold. And the dissolution continues underneath all of it, more slowly, more painfully, more expensively in terms of the energy required to maintain the performance of an identity that is in the process of being outgrown. Reality check. If you are currently trying to get your old self back, you are trying to survive the very thing that is trying to complete you. The discomfort you are managing is the birth canal. Climbing back in is not an option. Moving through is the only direction that leads somewhere other than prolonged stagnation dressed as stability. The third chapter is the specific trap of spiritual ambition. The mask looks like this. You took the awakening seriously. You did the reading, the practice, the inner work. You began to develop a genuine relationship with your own psychological and spiritual depths. And then, with a subtlety that was almost invisible, the awakening became a project. The inner work became an achievement domain. You started tracking your progress, comparing your development to others, building a new identity organized around being someone who is awake, conscious, doing the work. The spiritual path,
became the new career, the new body, the new number in the account. The dark truth is that the ego, the psychological structure that the awakening was supposed to loosen, is extraordinarily adaptive. It does not resist the awakening by defending the old identity. It embraces the awakening and colonizes it. It builds a new identity from the materials of consciousness and depth and shadow work, and uses that identity to perform the same fundamental operation it has always performed: the maintenance of specialists, the management of status, the continuous project of being a particular kind of person, now a spiritual one, in front of an audience that now includes your own self-concept. And the motivation that comes from this is particularly dangerous because it feels more meaningful than the old ambition. It feels like it's coming from somewhere real. But it is organized around the same fundamental structure: the ego using the language of transcendence to perpetuate its own project. The strategic kill is the death of your investment in your own awakening as an identity. This is the most unsettling of the 5 kills because it sounds like an argument against the very process that led you here. It is not. It is the recognition that genuine development cannot be owned or performed or leveraged for self-concept. The moment you are using your spiritual depth as a component of your social presentation, you are not in the process of awakening. You are in the process of redecorating the ego with more sophisticated materials. What must die is the attachment to being someone who has arrived at a particular level of consciousness, not consciousness itself, the attachment to it as a possession. The 4th chapter is what the absence of motivation is actually telling you. The mask looks like this. The absence of motivation is a problem, a symptom of something wrong, a state to be resolved and moved past as efficiently as possible. You treat it the way you treat illness, something that shouldn't be there, something that interrupts the real business of life. You are willing to examine it briefly, to extract whatever lesson it contains, but the goal is to move through it and back into productive engagement with the world.
The dark truth is that the absence of motivation at this stage of development is not a symptom, it is a communication. The psyche, which has been trying to redirect your energy from the performance of an inherited life toward the construction of an authentic one, has finally found the only tool powerful enough to stop you long enough to listen. The flatness is not the absence of life force. It is the deliberate withdrawal of life force from every channel that was never actually yours. Your system is refusing to generate genuine energy for goals that belong to a version of you that is being retired. Not because those goals were wrong in any moral sense, because they were assembled from the outside in rather than discovered from the inside out. And the system, which knows the difference, even when the conscious mind argues, will not continue to power them with the same conviction it once did. Jung described this as the libido moving inward, the life energy that was flowing outward toward achievement and status, and the continuous performance of a successful identity beginning to withdraw and pool in the depths, where it will become available for something different. This process feels like depletion because you are measuring it with the instruments of the old system. You are checking the fuel gauge of a vehicle that is being retired and concluding that something is wrong with the fuel. Nothing is wrong with the fuel. It is being redirected. The strategic kill is the death of your interpretation of the flatness as failure. What must be killed is not the flatness itself, but the story you are telling about what the flatness means. When you stop treating the absence of the old motivation as a diagnosis of dysfunction and begin treating it as the space in which something new is gathering itself,
The quality of your relationship to the present moment changes, not immediately, not dramatically, but the energy that was being consumed by the management of the story about what is wrong begins to become available for actual presence in the experience of what is. Reality check. The part of you that is most resistant to sitting with the flatness is not the part that cares about your future. It is the part that is afraid of what you will discover about the previous decade if you stop moving long enough to look at it clearly. The busyness was never just productivity, it was also protection. And what it was protecting you from is exactly what the flatness is now making available.
The fifth chapter is the architecture of what comes after. The mask looks like this. You expect the new motivation, when it arrives, to feel like the old motivation. Energizing, directional, organized around clear goals with legible outcomes. You are waiting for the signal to return at the same frequency, on the same channel, with the same quality of urgency and clarity. And because it has not returned in that form, you conclude it has not returned at all. The dark truth is that what comes after the dissolution does not arrive as motivation in the conventional sense. It arrives as something far quieter and far more durable. Jung called it vocation, and he was careful to distinguish it from ambition. Ambition is organized around the self-concept. It wants the results because the results confirm the identity. Vocation is organized around something that the self-concept is in service of. It has a quality of necessity rather than desire, of compulsion rather than goal setting. The person who has passed through the dissolution and arrived at vocation does not hustle toward it. They are drawn toward it by something they cannot fully articulate and cannot choose to ignore. It does not require external validation to sustain because it is not organized around external validation. It does not require constant reignition because it is not a fire you light. It is the fire that is already burning and that you either serve or spend your energy suppressing. This is not a romantic description of a mystical state available only to artists and contemplatives. It is a clinical description of what the motivational architecture looks like when it has been reorganized around an internal center rather than an external one. It is available to people in finance and construction and medicine and every other domain of ordinary human work. The domain is not the point. The source of the organizing principle is the point. And the source is the difference between spending your productive years powering someone else's definition of a life and spending them in the service of something that your own deepest interior has authenticated. The path to that reorganization runs directly through what you are currently experiencing, not around it, not over it, through it. The flatness is the transition zone. The dissolution is the prerequisite. The loss of the old motivation is the cost of admission to the motivational architecture that cannot be taken from you because it was never given to you by anything that can be withdrawn. This is what that means practically, because this is where most discussions of awakening and motivation become usefully abstract and useless in the specific. In the period between the collapse of the old motivation and the full emergence of the new, you are not supposed to be operating at the previous output level. You are not supposed to be generating the same volume of goal-directed activity with the same quality of urgency. The system is in a restructuring phase, and restructuring phases require a different allocation of resources than operational phases. What is required in this phase is not more effort in the direction of the old goals. It is careful, honest,
unhurried attention to what the new signal feels like when it appears, because it will appear. It appears first as small pulses of genuine interest, a topic, a problem, a form of engagement that produces not the anxious energy of ambition, but the quiet, steady quality of genuine resonance. These pulses are easily missed if you are measuring them against the standard of the old motivation. They are smaller, less dramatic, unaccompanied by the social validation that the old ambition was organized to attract. But they are more reliable as indicators of the actual direction because they are arising from a source that is not contingent on external conditions. The practice, if practice is the right word for something this organic, is to follow these pulses without requiring them to immediately justify themselves in terms of outcomes, to allow the new direction to emerge from genuine interior inquiry rather than forcing it into the familiar architecture of goal and achievement and legible result. This is uncomfortable for anyone who has built their identity around productive output. It looks from the outside like drift. It feels from the inside like a betrayal of everything you worked to build. It is neither. It is the specific work that this phase of development requires. And the people who do it, who resist the pressure to return to the previous mode and instead allow the full restructuring to complete, emerge with a relationship to their own work and their own life that the previous version of them, for all its achievements, never had access to. The old version of you, the one that ran on borrowed hunger and external validation and the continuous performance of an identity assembled from other people's definitions of success, that version has not simply lost its motivation, it is losing its coherence. It is in the process of being superseded by something that you do not yet have a complete picture of, and that you cannot build by trying to hold the previous picture together while the new one forms.
This is not a comfortable truth. Comfort is not what this channel is for. What this channel is for is the kind of precision that makes the right work possible when the comfortable diagnosis has failed you, and the flatness is still there, and the old tools are still not working, and the question underneath all of it is finally loud enough to stop being avoided. The question of what you are actually for, not what you are capable of, not what you can achieve, what you are for, in the specific, interior, unchosen sense of what the deepest part of your own psychological architecture is oriented toward when all the noise of borrowed ambition has finally gone quiet. That question is not answered in this script. It is not answered by any content or any framework or any map that someone else drew. It is answered in the silence that the awakening has created and that you have been trying to fill. Stay in the silence long enough, and the answer does not arrive as an idea. It arrives as a direction, as a quality of pull that does not require your agreement or your enthusiasm. It simply requires that you stop running in the opposite direction. The old version of you cannot survive what you now know. That is not a threat. It is a description of a biological fact about psychological development. The caterpillar does not survive the chrysalis. That is the point of the chrysalis. What you are experiencing is not the end of your productive life. It is the end of the version of productivity that was never fully yours to begin with. The question is not whether you will survive this. The question is whether you will let it finish what it started.